My name is Earl Preston. I was 56 that winter, and if you asked around Iron Hollow in the Upper Peninsula, people would have told you I was a mechanic first, a fisherman second, and a skeptic about anything spooky a distant third. I never had patience for ghost stories at the bait counter, never blamed bad luck on curses, never thought shadows had motives. I measured life by practical numbers: hourly labor rate, tire pressure, wind chill, diesel price, and how many minutes before your fingers stopped listening to you in January air. Then, Black Spruce Lake taught me there are things that do not care what you believe. I am telling this straight because I survived it and because I only stayed alive by paying attention when the woods stopped behaving like woods. Preston Auto and Marine sat on the edge of town where the plow trucks parked in a crooked row and salt crusted every fender from November through March. The building was block walls and old steel trusses, 2 bays in front, 1 narrow bay in back for boat motors and carburetor jobs when the weather turned. My father started it in 1978 with 1 lift and a borrowed compressor. By the time I took over, we had 3 lifts, a parts cage, a stubborn furnace, and a coffee pot that tasted like burnt pennies no matter how often I cleaned it. People brought me what winter punished: dead batteries, cracked hoses, seized calipers, frozen throttle cables, transfer cases that sounded like gravel in a drum. I liked that work because machines told the truth. If something failed, there was a reason. I opened at 7, 6 days a week. I salted the front step, flipped the sign, and wrote each job on a whiteboard in block letters big enough to read from under a hood. Usually it went Dan Klein, plow pump leak, Ruth Bailey, no heat, maybe blend door, township truck 3, front end noise. I moved through the day in layers. Diagnostics first, parts calls before lunch, heavy wrenching after, cleanup last. The radio stayed low, mostly weather and farm reports. And by habit, I checked the extended forecast at 10 and 3 because that told me who would be stranded tomorrow. My hands were permanently marked by little things: knuckle scars, a burn line across one wrist, nails that never quite came clean. I didn't mind. It was honest wear. I had been widowed for just under 2 years then. My wife, Lena, died of a sudden aneurysm in April. No warning, no long goodbye, just a phone call that split my life into before and after. In town, people gave me space in that polite rural way: an extra casserole, fewer questions, eyes that moved off your face when they saw the weight you carried. I handled grief the same way I handled broken engines. I built routine around it until it would at least idle. Work until dusk, lock up, drive out to Black Spruce Lake, drill, set tip-ups, run a line finder, sit in the insulated shack with a propane lantern and a thermos. Catching walleye was almost incidental. What mattered was the sequence. Sequence kept the mind from drifting into places with no traction. The road to the lake turned from county blacktop to plowed gravel, then to packed snow where cedar and black spruce crowded the shoulders so tight your headlights felt swallowed. In dry months, it was 31 minutes from my shop door to the access pull-off. In January, it was 45 if the wind had loaded drifts across the low spots. I knew every bend, every rut that could throw a truck sideways if you came in lazy, every stretch where cell signal vanished. Folks called Black Spruce a moody lake because of its pressure ridges and weird under-ice currents. I called it predictable if you respected it. The ice sang there, low and booming at night. And if you listened long enough, you could tell strain from settling, warning from ordinary noise. My shack sat about 80 yards from the access trail, painted dull green, skids braced, insulation patched twice after one rough season. I kept it spare. 2 stools, 1 rack for rods, heater, lantern, first aid pouch, spare gloves in a dry box, hand auger scoop, grit bucket for footing near the door. I swept shavings, kept hooks organized by size, and wrote lake notes in a pocket notebook: date, temperature, wind direction, depth, lure color, bite times. That was me all over. Track enough variables and the world usually made sense. A younger guy at the bait shop once called me old school obsessive. I told him obsession was what you called preparation after you had never spent an hour stranded with wet socks and no plan. He laughed and I laughed too, because he looked like I did at 30, confident for reasons winter had not corrected yet. My sister Gail lived in Marquette and called every Sunday evening. She worked property management and kept 3 calendars going at once: 1 for tenants, 1 for repairs, 1 for family. She worried in practical language, asked if I had enough firewood, if the shop insurance had been renewed, if my truck tires were less than 4 winters old. I reassured her by giving specifics, because specifics were harder to argue with. Tread depth, furnace filter date, blood pressure from the pharmacy kiosk. I did not tell her how quiet the house felt after closing, or how I still looked toward the passenger seat at stoplights. Instead, I said I was fine because fine was easier than honest. By the 2nd week of January, my routine had settled into something close to stable. I would close the shop at 5:30 or 6, depending on backlog, and be on the ice by 7. Some nights I stayed only 2 hours. Some nights, when the bite was steady and the cold dry, I stayed until nearly midnight and drove home, with the heater blasting my knees and old country music crackling through static. I saw the same signs each night: fox tracks threading the shoreline, coyote chatter carrying from the far timber, ravens dropping in at dawn for scraps left near the fish-clean table by the summer cabins. The lake had its sounds and rhythms. I trusted those more than most people I knew. The first thing that changed was not a sight. It was absence. One night I stepped out of my truck and realized the tree line had gone still in a way that felt rehearsed, like every animal had agreed to hold its breath. No coyote calls, not even distant ones. No fox tracks near my bait bucket the next evening, and the snow there was fresh enough to keep detail. Then the ravens stopped showing. I noticed because they always came, always argued over guts in the morning, like old men at a hardware store. 3 mornings in a row. Nothing but wind combing through spruce needles and the faint creak of my shack skids. I told myself there was a simple reason: weather shift, prey movement, maybe a bobcat passing through and pushing smaller scavengers out. You can explain a lot if you keep your nerve and your assumptions narrow. On the 4th night, I found prints near the pressure ridge that did not fit anything I knew. I crouched with my flashlight and laid my glove beside one depression for scale, bigger than my spread hand by a couple inches, deep through crust, where my own boots barely dented. The toe marks were distinct, but not a wolf pattern, not bear either. The stride spacing bothered me more than size. The prints did not wander or weave. They moved in long, direct intervals between drifts, as if whatever made them carried weight high and forward, not low, like a 4-legged animal cutting through snow. I walked the line twice, then a 3rd time with my head down, trying to force it into some familiar category. I got cold doing that, kneeling on glare ice, while my brain argued with my eyes. I took photos on my phone. I measured rough distance heel to heel with a tape from my truck and wrote numbers in my notebook. 17 feet across 4 impressions. Not clean enough for courtroom certainty, but enough to bother a man who had tracked deer and coyote sign his whole life. I told myself kids could have carved prank blocks and stomped around. I told myself melting and refreezing could distort edges. I told myself maybe 2 different sets overlaid and made one weird pattern. That internal debate followed me home, into the garage, into bed. Rational thought felt less like confidence and more like a task list I kept rewriting because the first draft would not hold. The next evening, the propane lantern in my shack started flickering in short pulses. Not a dying sputter, more like someone turning a dimmer knob with quick fingers. I checked the tank connection, valve, mantle, air mix. Everything looked normal. Then a smell moved in under the door seam. Wet fur and musk, strong enough to cut through propane and old fish. It came and went in waves, and each time it thickened, the lantern stuttered harder. I opened the door and swept my headlamp over the ice, snow, shoreline brush. Empty. My line finder screen jumped at the same time, depth readout glitching, then flattening to static bars before snapping back. I swore at the unit, pulled the battery, reseated it, checked contacts. All clean, no corrosion. I tried to laugh it off. One of those thin laughs that dies before it reaches your throat. I had spent decades fixing machines for people who blamed electronics for every mystery. Moisture, loose terminal, cold-soaked battery. That was 90% of it. The other 10 was operator error nobody wanted to admit. I sat there with my gloves on and repeated those facts like they were prayer. Still, each time that musky smell drifted back, the finder twitched. The lantern dipped. The skin between my shoulders tightened for no clear reason. I knew fear from real emergencies, rollovers, barn fires, nights pulling a stuck truck from a ditch in whiteout conditions. This felt different. Less panic and more ancient warning. The kind that arrives before your logic catches up. On the third night of the flicker problem, wind drove powder snow low and fast across the ice, turning my headlamp beam into a tunnel of glittering static. I was 30 yards from the shack, checking a tip-up near the ridge, when I sensed I was being watched from the cedar edge. I lifted my light and saw 2 reflections appear between trunks, an amber green, level and far too high, just above my truck cab line if you drew it straight across. They did not blink. They did not sway like deer eyes when a body shifts weight. They held steady for 7 seconds that felt like a full minute stretched thin. Then they were gone, not ducking, not turning, just absent. No branch snap, no rush through brush, nothing. I stood there with my auger in one hand and the light in the other, listening hard enough to hear my own pulse in my ears. My first thought was a hunter messing around with reflective tape. My second thought was that no hunter I knew could stand that still in blowing snow at that height without support. I backed to the shack without turning my shoulders fully away from the tree line, shut the door, and checked my truck keys twice. Inside, I made myself go through ordinary motions. Relight lantern, tighten mitts, check heater, write a note. 9:14 p.m. Eyes and cedars. Height, abnormal. I wrote that last word 3 times and crossed out 2 of them like grammar might reduce what I had seen. By the time I drove back toward town, the road looked the same as always. Plow berms, reflector posts, dark houses set back from the county line, normal shapes, familiar distance markers. But the routine had a crack in it now, thin and sharp, and I could feel cold air coming through. I did not tell anyone that night. I parked behind my shop, sat with the engine idling, and watched frost creep over the inside corners of the windshield while I tried to fit those 7 seconds into a world that had always made mechanical sense. I could not do it. Not yet. So I went home, locked both deadbolts, and laid my boots by the door facing outward, ready for a fast exit I still told myself I would never need. I left those boots, pointed at the door, and sat at my kitchen table without turning on the television. The house had all the regular sounds: refrigerator cycling, baseboard heat ticking, a truck passing 2 streets over, and I treated each one like a test I had to pass. If I could name it, I could keep it small. I made coffee I did not need, drank half a mug, and checked the deadbolts again. At 1 a.m, I stood at the sink, looking into my own dark reflection, and told myself I was reacting to grief and lack of sleep, that loneliness sharpened patterns, until normal things looked menacing. I told myself that twice, then went to bed fully dressed except for my coat and slept in bursts so short they barely counted. At 4:30, I gave up and drove to the shop while stars were still hard white pinpoints above the grain elevator. Work should have steadied me. It usually did. I had a fuel pump job on a county plow truck and a starter replacement on a logging skidder. Both jobs that required attention, and both jobs that gave no room for drifting thoughts. By 9, my hands were moving on habit, wrench, ratchet, flashlight, torque, wipe, recheck. Then I found myself staring at a fan belt for no reason, listening for cedar branches that were 30 miles away. That bothered me more than the eyes had. Fear was one thing. Losing focus around heavy equipment could get a man hurt. I closed a little earlier than usual and drove back to Black Spruce with a stricter plan than normal. I parked nose out for a faster exit. I kept the driver door unlocked. I set my headlamp on high and left my truck running while I checked the shack and holes. I even hung a strip of orange survey tape 6 feet up on the nearest cedar at the shoreline edge. My own crude visual marker so I could judge height if I saw reflections again. Practical steps, measurable steps. The wind was light and the sky clear enough to throw a brittle moonlit sheen across the pressure ridge. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then I realized the lake had gone silent again, deeper than the first night. Even the tiny noises were gone. No wing beats, no scratching from snow mice under crust near the brush, no bark from the distant farm dogs that usually carried from the south shore when the air turned dense. My breath sounded loud inside my balaclava. I checked each tip-up, reset one flag, and moved slower than I needed to, because my body was waiting for something my eyes still could not find. At the second hole, my line finder glitched the same way as before, but this time it spiked and dropped 3 times in quick sequence, as if a large object rose under the transducer and moved away. I jerked the cable up and looked at the wet line in my glove like it might offer an explanation. Nothing. The screen settled, then flickered to static. At the same moment that musky, wet fur odor slipped across the ice from the cedar side, strong enough to make the back of my throat tighten, I cut the finder, stood up, and swept my light in a full arc. No eye shine, No movement. I heard a single sound then, not loud, just wrong for that distance and temperature. A heavy exhale from somewhere beyond the first tree line where the bank rose toward the old logging trail. Not wind in branches. Not a deer snort. Air pushed through a larger chest than I wanted to imagine. I walked backward to my truck, opened the passenger door, and pulled my 12 gauge from behind the seat. I did not chamber around. I held it across my forearms and waited 5 full minutes with my light fixed on that dark strip between the cedars. Nothing showed, but the feeling of being measured stayed with me. I locked up and drove home earlier than planned, angry at myself for leaving and angrier that leaving felt smart. By the second week of that pattern, I had started recording every anomaly in the notebook I used for fish depth and lure notes, and the pages looked less like fishing records and more like incident logs. The next escalation came with tracks that made my previous set look almost ambiguous. These were fresh over wind-smoothed crust, and they did not cross the lake at random. They paralleled my approach from the access trail to the shack, staying in the low shadow just outside my headlamp spill, then cut in close to the back wall where I kept my spare propane tank. I crouched and measured again. Same oversized impressions, same toe depth, but the stride changed. Shorter now near the shack. Deliberate, as if whatever made them had slowed to inspect. I followed the line 20 yards and found where it stopped at the edge of a drift and resumed on glare ice with no transition marks I could read. That was the first time my skin crawled in a way I couldn't reason down. A bear would leave a different pattern and would not move that cleanly on exposed ice. A wolf pack would show multiple tracks and lower body drag where snow deepened. A person in snowshoes would print different edges, and no person I knew could produce that depth in hard crust. Without post-holing, I ran every option anyway because options were better than the alternative. 2 nights later, I got the sign that ended any pretense of harmless curiosity. I had just stepped out of the shack to check the truck clock when I saw a shape cross between the moon and the pressure ridge, left to right, black on silver, broad in the shoulders, and narrow through the hips, moving upright in 3 long silent strides that looked almost like frames dropped from a film reel. I had set a marker pole there myself, an 8-foot fiberglass rod with reflective tape near the top to flag a rough crack line. The silhouette passed behind it, and the head rose clearly above that tape by at least 2 feet. I did not shout. I did not chase. I froze long enough to verify what I had seen, then got inside the truck and locked the doors with hands that shook hard enough to miss the switch on the first try. I stayed there with the engine idling, heater fan low, lights off, counting breaths and staring at the ridge until my neck cramped. The shape did not return. After 15 minutes, I began to reverse in slow arcs toward the access line, avoiding the rough seam near the south edge. Halfway back, I saw new movement in my side mirror. Close this time, low, then rising, and heard claws scrape briefly against packed snow near the rear quarter panel. I accelerated and fishtailed once before catching traction. In the rear view mirror, my tail lights painted a slice of ice red, and for a second I caught those amber-green eyes again at hood height near my shack door, fixed on the truck, perfectly level. That image sat with me all the way home and into the next morning. Something was not just present. It was tracking routine. It knew where I parked, where I walked, where I lingered. I started my investigation like I handled any intermittent mechanical fault. Isolate variables, confirm with repeat evidence, seek second opinion, avoid assumptions. Daylight first. On Sunday, I returned to Black Spruce at 10 in the morning with casting plaster, a steel tape, flag markers, and my old film camera from before phone lenses got good in cold weather. In sun, the place looked almost ordinary again. Blue sky, jack pine shadows striped over crust, an ice fisherman 2 bays over drilling with a gas auger. That false normalcy annoyed me, like the lake was pretending innocence in daylight. I found partial tracks near the shack, but overnight wind had softened edges. I still cast 2 impressions and bagged some dark, coarse hairs snagged on a split board at the back corner where I had never seen fur before. They were longer than coyote guard hairs and stiffer than domestic dog. I photographed claw scores in the ice by my truck parking spot. 4 parallel grooves in a fan pattern, each almost the length of my palm. Could have been auger drag marks if I hadn't known exactly where I set my tools and exactly how those marks hadn't been there the previous afternoon. After lunch, I drove to the bait shop in town, the one with minnow tanks humming by the register and old photos of pike on the wall from decades ago. Ray Tolan and Vince Mercer were leaning on the coffee counter in insulated bibs, arguing about snowmobile belts. They both knew me well enough to hear a change in my voice when I asked if either had seen large tracks near Black Spruce. Ray grinned first. "You checking deer with clown shoes now, Earl?" Vince laughed and said, "He fishes alone too much. Start seeing giant wolves and tax collectors." I put my phone on the counter and showed them the track photos. Ray leaned in, squinted, and shrugged. "Melted out. Could be anything. Big shepherd, maybe. Someone's mutt got loose, or you stepped in your own print weird." "My own print has tread blocks," I said. "These do not." Vince sipped coffee. "Then it is a bear walking funny. Happens. You want us to call a priest?" They were not cruel men, just certain the world ended where their own experience ended. I pocketed the phone, bought wax worms I did not need, and left with that thin, embarrassed anger you get when you know you sound unstable even while holding evidence. I called the regional wildlife office from the shop landline that afternoon because cell reception in my bay was spotty in winter. The clerk routed me to a conservation officer I had met once at a boat inspection checkpoint years earlier. I kept my report, plain, large unknown tracks, repeated activity around occupied ice shack, possible aggressive behavior, requested site assessment. He listened politely, asked if I had bait or carcasses stored, asked whether I had seen confirmed wolf sign in the area, then said they were short-staffed and could maybe send someone later in the week if weather held. His tone shifted when I mentioned eye height and upright movement. "Could be perception in low light," he said. "Snow and moon make distances weird. Probably a big canine. Keep food secured. Avoid nighttime solo. And if you feel unsafe, do not go back until we check." I wrote his name and time in my notebook, then asked for a case number. He gave one. That part was real at least. Gail called Sunday evening right on schedule. I almost skipped it, then answered because skipping would worry her more. She heard the strain before I said anything. "You sound tired. You sleeping at all?" "Not much." "Shop too busy?" "Partly, also lake stuff." I gave her the short version, strange tracks, animal near the shack, maybe a bear. I avoided details that would send her straight into panic mode. She did not buy it. "Sell that shack," she said. "I mean it. You do not need to prove anything to anyone. Fish in daylight with people around or stop for a while." "I've done that route for years." "You did a lot of things for years when Lena was here. That does not make them sacred. Come stay in Marquette a few nights." I stared at the parts shelves while she talked, labels and barcodes in clean order in neat rows. "I am fine," I said, and even as I said it, I knew the sentence had lost credibility. "You are not," she said softly, "and you do not have to do stubborn as a personality trait forever." After the call, I sat in my office chair with the lights off and listened to the compressor tank tick as it cooled. Her words landed because they were true, but truth did not solve the practical problem. Something was still out there near my shack and possibly near the access road. If it was a known predator behaving abnormally, someone needed to log it properly before a tourist family wandered into it in March. I spent that night searching old hunting forms and archived local papers. Key terms like wolf anomaly, upright canine, unclassified predator, black spruce incidents, cedar swamp attack, and came up mostly empty noise. 2 threads mentioned livestock losses in the late 90s west of the lake. No names, no official follow-up. One post from years back described eyes above hood line near County Spur 9 and then got mocked into deletion. I copied what I could and printed it anyway. Evidence did not become stronger because people laughed at it. On Tuesday, I ran a controlled check on my own equipment to rule out electronics failure. I tested 3 lanterns in the shop cold room with a portable fan and varying propane flow. No flicker pattern like the one on the ice. I tested 2 line finders in a stock tank with submerged metal tools passed below them. Both glitched briefly, but recovered cleanly, and neither produced the repeated static bars I had seen on the lake. I changed batteries in every field light, reset my truck's auxiliary relay, and mounted a magnetic floodlight over the rear cab window to widen coverage when backing off the ice. That evening, I set 2 trail cameras at Black Spruce in daylight, one facing the shack door and one aimed down the approach from the cedar edge. I mounted them higher than usual, nearly 7 feet, and angled down. If I was wrong, I would capture a normal animal and be done. If I was right, I needed proof that did not depend on how shaken I felt in the dark. When I checked them the next afternoon, both cameras had recorded in bursts between 8:12 and 8:19 the previous night while I was not there. The first showed blowing snow, then one frame with a dark vertical mass at the edge of the field, too close to the lens for clean focus, then static lines. The second camera had 5 corrupted files and 1 still image of the shack wall with 3 fresh gouges in the painted plywood near window height that hadn't been there when I left. I went to that wall and measured. The grooves were spaced like extended fingers, each cut deep enough to expose pale wood under 2 layers of green paint. That was my clear sign. Not curiosity, not random crossing tracks. Something had approached my shelter while it was occupied on previous nights, tested the structure, and returned when I was absent. Predatory behavior had a pattern. Approach, assess, probe, wait for weakness. I stood there in daylight with a tape measure in one hand and the camera in the other. And for the first time, I admitted the problem was bigger than proving I was not mistaken. I needed someone who had seen this before, if anyone had. Nolan Pike's name came to me then, retired game warden. Used to run patrols north of the county line, back when I was still doing tune-ups on carbureted snow rigs. People said he was quiet, stubborn, and hard to impress. Exactly the kind of man I wanted. I drove back to town, pulled over beside the old feed mill where I could get 2 bars of signal, and called the number I found through a mutual customer. Pike answered on the 4th ring, voice rough and controlled. And when I said my name and mentioned black spruce, he did not interrupt once. He let me finish, then stayed silent long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he said, "Do not go out there alone tonight." I was not planning to. You planning and you doing can be different, Earl. I looked out at the plowed shoulder and the dark pines beyond it. Can I show you what I have? Another pause. Tomorrow. Back table at Lindell Diner, 6:30 in the morning. Bring prints, photos, and any hair sample you kept clean. Off the record unless I tell you otherwise. The line clicked dead and I sat there with the phone in my hand, engine idling, watching the first flakes of new snow begin to move sideways across the windshield. The flakes thickened fast, hissing sideways over the windshield, and I sat there long enough for a white line to build along the wiper blades. Before I put the truck in gear, I went straight back to the shop, carried the plaster casts, bagged hair sample, and printed photos into the office, and laid everything on my desk like evidence in a case I still hoped had a boring explanation. I labeled each item with date and time, then sealed them in freezer bags so road slush would not soak through in the morning. It was fussy work, and that was the point. If my hands were busy, my head stayed out of the ditch. I did not go to the lake that night. I told myself I was following Pike's instruction, but the truth was simpler. I did not want to stand on open ice in blowing snow with only one truck door between me and whatever had left those gouges. I slept in broken chunks again, waking to the sound of wind shouldering the siding, and by 5:30 I was on County 11 headed toward Lindell Diner with a thermos between the seats and my jaw tight enough to ache. Lindell sat low and square by the highway junction, neon sign buzzing open in one corner, where 2 letters had gone dim years ago and never got fixed. Pike was already in the back booth, coffee in front of him, heavy canvas coat folded beside him, cap brim pulled low. He looked older than I remembered and harder around the eyes, the way men look when retirement removes the uniform but not the memories. I slid the bags and envelope across the table. That's everything I have. He did not touch coffee again until he had looked at every photo twice. He held one print shot up toward the window, then set it down and tapped the table once with his index finger. You kept chain of custody better than half the reports I used to get. I run a shop. Paperwork keeps people honest. He gave a tight nod and opened the bag with the hairs, careful 2 fingers only. You tell anyone besides your sister and 2 clowns at the bait counter? Wildlife office got a hazard call, case number in my notebook. Any deputy statements? No. Good, he said, and the word landed heavier than it should have. I leaned forward. You set off the record. Why? He held my gaze for a long second. Because if you file this as what you think it is, they will file you as unstable and bury the rest under wolf language. That happened before. More than once. Before where? Near Black Spruce, also north of Harlan Cut, 90s. He folded the photos back into the envelope and pushed them to me. 3 predatory incidents, all unclassifiable. We logged them as wolf anomalies under pressure. That was the instruction. I felt the booth vinyl creak under my hands. What did you see yourself? Enough to stop night patrols alone in cedar corridors. He finally took a sip of coffee. Listen carefully. If you catch eyes above hood height, do not stand there sorting theories. You already picked your exit route before you step out of the truck. If you did not, stay in town. The waitress topped his cup and moved on. Neither of us touched the menu. I need my cameras and gear, I said. Shack too. I can't leave it open. Then daylight only. Today, if weather gives you a window, if you smell wet fur and your electronics twitch, leave. Do not wait for visual confirmation. I'm not jumpy by nature. That's not a virtue out there. He leaned in just enough to lower his voice without theatrics. Predator intelligence is pattern plus patience. It studies routine, not courage. You've had it circling your routine for days. We sat in silence after that. Spoon clinks and fryer noise from the front, filling the booth gap where normal conversation should have gone. When I stood to leave, Pike wrote a second number on my receipt and slid it over. Home line. Call if anything changes tonight. I tucked it into my wallet. You expecting that? I'm expecting Winter to do what Winter does. Move sound wrong and hide distance. He held my eyes again. And I'm expecting you to underestimate how close it can get without noise. By noon, the wind eased enough to show blue in broken strips. I loaded fresh batteries, a new memory card, and my 12-gauge, drove to Black Spruce, and parked at the access with the truck facing out. Daylight made the whole place feel ordinary in that insulting way it had before. Ice anglers scattered far west. A snowmobile trail cut fresh near the opposite shore. Crows arguing in one stand of birch like nothing had ever gone wrong here. I moved fast. Camera 1 came down intact. Camera 2 had a cracked latch but still held data. I bagged both. I checked the shack walls, took new photos of the gouges with a ruler for scale, and replaced the backboard with a scrap panel I kept under the bench. Around 3:30, the sun slid behind a gray lid of cloud, and the light flattened. My plan had been to leave by 4. I was coiling extension cord when my glove brushed the lantern valve, and I realized I'd left the spare mantle kit in the shack loft. I climbed up, found it, and came down slower because my right calf had started that dull cramp it sometimes got in deep cold. By the time I stepped outside again, dusk had thickened along the cedar edge. Not dark yet, but close enough that color had drained to steel and black. I heard no coyote calls, no wing noise, no little movement in shoreline brush. That silence rolled across the lake like a weather front, and my stomach dropped before my mind found words for why. I locked the shack and headed for the truck, keys already in my right hand, shotgun slung muzzle down. Halfway there, the magnetic floodlight over my rear cab blinked once and came back at half strength. Then full, then out for a beat. I stopped walking and looked at the battery volt gauge through the windshield. Normal. The smell arrived next, sudden and thick. Wet fur left too long in a thaw, mixed with that sour musky note I had noticed each night the lantern glitched. It moved across me in a ribbon, then thinned. My skin went tight across my shoulders. I heard Pike in my head, like he was in the cab with me. If you catch eyes above hood height, do not stand there sorting theories. I brought the headlamp up and swept the cedar line once, slow and even. Snow dust drifted low near the bank. Branches held still. On the second pass, 2 points lit at the edge of the beam. Amber green, perfectly level, set deep enough apart that my first thought was distance wrong. Maybe 2 reflectors, not 1 animal. Then my eye caught the survey tape I had tied days earlier, still fluttering faintly on the leftmost cedar. The reflections were higher than that tape. I held the beam fixed. 7 seconds. I counted without meaning to. 1001, 1002, no blink, no sway, no deer head tilt, no human shift. Just 2 steady points, at a height no wolf could hold and no person could mimic without a ladder in deep snow. I told myself there could be a stump-catching angle, glass, ice crystal, anything. I told myself my depth perception in failing light had fooled me before on storm roads. I told myself that while my legs were already moving backward toward the truck, at 1007 the eyes were gone, not dropped, not turned, gone, as if someone had switched off 2 LEDs in empty air. No branch crack, no brush push, no footfall. The silence afterward was so complete, I could hear coolant ticking in my own engine block through the hood. I reached the truck, opened the door, and got in without taking the lamp off the cedar line. Lock button, engine start, headlights full. Nothing in the beams except snow and tree trunks and my own tire ruts. I sat there with my foot on the brake and the shotgun across my lap, breath fogging and clearing against the inside glass. I did not peel out. Panic gets trucks stuck. I backed in a controlled arc and eased toward the access, watching mirrors, then forward view, then mirrors again. Near the pressure ridge, my rear tires crossed rough ice and chattered. For half a second, I saw movement on the passenger side, tall and dark and too close to the hood line. Then it slid out of the beam and was gone before shape resolved. Could have been shadow. Could have been brush bending in wind that I could not feel through the cab. Could have been exactly what I thought it was. I drove to town with my high beams on the whole way and still checked the rear view every 10 seconds, like a man who expects something to rise in it. Back at the shop, I parked inside Bay 2 with the overhead door down, then sat in the cab until my hands stopped trembling enough to write. I logged the encounter with exact times from the dash clock, location relative to the cedar tape marker, estimated height above truck cab, and duration of eye shine. I did not sleep. Around midnight, I called Pike's home line. He answered on the second ring. Talk. I read from the notebook to keep emotion out of it. When I finished, he waited a moment and said, "That was a test pass. It wanted to know your response time and retreat path. You're saying it's tracking behavior. I'm saying you are no longer dealing with random wildlife movement." I pressed my thumb into the bridge of my nose. I kept thinking if I did the measurements right, if I logged enough, this would collapse into something normal. Normal is not a strategy. Procedure is. His voice stayed calm, almost tired. Do not return at night. If you must go at all, daylight and with someone. You listening? Yes. Good. Call me tomorrow afternoon after you pull camera data. The line went dead and I sat in the dark office with the notebook open and a wrench grease stain on the page margin. I wanted to believe that fatigue had stretched those 7 seconds into a story I would regret telling. I wanted to believe my brain, still raw from 2 years of sleeping alone in a quiet house, had turned fear into geometry. I wanted to believe a lot of things. 3 days passed before the weather gave me another stable window to reach black spruce. And by then my denial had evolved into a colder form. I stopped arguing that nothing was there and started arguing that whatever was there could still fit inside known biology if I stayed strict about evidence. Large rogue wolf with a typical posture, injured bear using rear legs intermittently, human in thermal gear and mask. Each theory broke on one detail, then another, then another. But I kept rebuilding because that was easier than admitting I had no category left. I did not go alone the second time. I asked Travis Moulton, who did occasional welding at my shop and hunted coyotes in winter, to ride out with me in daylight to help drag the shack skids closer to the access before thaw season. I gave him the cleaned-up version. Something big has been nosing around. He brought his own rifle, no jokes this time. By late afternoon, we had the shack shifted 20 yards and one skid jammed in crust. Clouds moved in from the west, low and fast, carrying fine snow that cut visibility in pulses. Travis wanted to finish the pull and leave. I agreed. We hooked chain to the truck hitch and eased forward in low gear. The skid popped free, then stuck again near the marker pole by the pressure ridge. I stepped out to reset the chain angle and felt that same quiet settle over the ice, total and immediate. No auger noise from the west bay now, no wind through spruce, though I could see snow moving. Just that pressure in the ears like the world had been padded. "Earl," Travis said from the driver window, voice sharper than I had heard from him in 10 years. "You seeing that?" I turned toward the ridge. At first it read as a vertical tear in the blowing snow, darker than trunks, moving left to right between us and the pale strip of sky over the far shore. Then it crossed behind my fiberglass marker pole, and scale snapped into place so hard my knees weakened. The top of that shape rose well above the reflective tape and kept rising another 2 feet at least, maybe more. Shoulders broad as a chest freezer, hips narrow, head forward on a neck that looked too upright for any four-legged frame. It did not run. It covered distance in 3 long strides, silent, each placement exact, as if it knew where traction held and where crust would crack. The movement had a spring-loaded quality at the lower legs, hawk-like joints loading and releasing in a way no human gait could fake on ice. For 1 second, the silhouette turned slightly toward us, and I saw one eye catch light. Not bright this time, just a dull amber point under a heavy brow line. Then it slipped through blowing snow toward the cedar cut and vanished behind black trunks without so much as a branch twitch. Travis swore once under his breath and chambered around so fast the metallic click sounded huge in the silence. "That was a man in a ghillie suit, right? Tell me that was some idiot in a suit." "No," I said, and my own voice sounded far away. "No man moves like that here." He kept scanning the tree line, rifle up. "Bear?" "Not upright at that height, not that stride." "We leave, right now." I nodded, rehooked the chain with fingers gone clumsy, and climbed in. We pulled the shack the last stretch in jerks, both of us watching side windows more than the path ahead. Twice I thought I saw parallel movement in the trees pacing us, too smooth for snowshoe travel, too high for wolf. Could have been my own fear projecting. Could have been accurate threat tracking. I did not test it by stopping. At the access, we dropped the shack and loaded tools in silence. Travis finally looked at me full on, snow melting in his beard, eyes narrowed hard. "You telling this to anyone official?" "I already made one hazard call." He shook his head. "Use my name if you need to. I saw it. I don't care who laughs." That mattered more than I admitted out loud. Validation did not reduce danger, but it cut the self-doubt that had been chewing me hollow. I drove him back to town, then parked behind my shop as full dark settled over Iron Hollow. Inside the office, I replayed the silhouette again and again, each pass adding detail I wished I did not have. broad shoulders, narrow hips, silent stride, height against the marker pole I had set myself. The measurements did not lie. My eyes did not lie. Still, somewhere in me, a stubborn piece kept trying to force the image back into ordinary language. By closing time, I had convinced myself of one thin, temporary comfort. Maybe distance and blowing snow had exaggerated size. Maybe stress had edited movement. Maybe we had seen a rare convergence of bad light and fear. I wrote that line in my notebook and underlined it, not because I believed it, but because I needed one sentence that let me sleep for a few hours before the next night came. I shut the notebook, killed the office light, and stretched out on the vinyl bench in the parts room with my coat balled under my head. Sleep came in thin strips, 10 minutes here, 20 there, each one ending with my body jolting awake at some harmless sound. Furnace kick on, ice dropping off the gutter, a truck changing gears on Main. At 3:40 I gave up, made stale coffee, and opened the bay door to a sky packed with stars and bitter dry cold. The world looked clean again, like winter had reset the board overnight and erased every mark I did not want on it. I worked through the morning with a controlled kind of tunnel vision, timing belts, brake lines, one cracked manifold stud that fought me for an hour. Travis came by near noon to settle his welding invoice and stood in my office doorway with his hat in both hands, not talking about what we saw until he was already halfway out. "You heading back there tonight?" "No." He held my eyes, reading the lie. "Then make it true." After he left, I stared at the wall clock and listened to the second hand click around. I had told myself I was done with black spruce after dark. That sentence lasted until late afternoon, when I reached for my lockbox and realized the old film camera from the cast day was not on the shelf where I kept it. I checked the desk, truck cab, shack inventory list. Then I remembered exactly where I had set it, on the upper bunk shelf in the shack loft when my calf cramped and I rushed out. Loaded with half a roll that included the gouges, the track casts, the ridge marker line. Not decisive evidence by itself, but part of my chain, part of my control. Losing it felt like giving ground. I told myself I would do a simple retrieval, in and out. No fishing, no lingering, no theory testing. I left the shop at 5:15 with high beams checked, floodlight relay replaced again, and the 12 gauge racked where my right hand could reach it without looking. I wore 2 headlamps, one on my cap, one clipped to my bib strap as a backup. Every move had procedure wrapped around it, and procedure kept my hands from shaking. By Thursday evening, the temperature had dropped to 9 below, and the snowpack had gone powder dry, the kind that squeaked under boots and carried scent in sharp, clean lines. The county access was empty when I arrived. No other trucks, no auger noise from West Bay, no coyote talk from the ridge timber. Just my engine idling and the faint ticking from the fan clutch as it cooled between cycles. I parked nose out and left the engine running. The shack sat where we dragged it, closer to the trail, a dark box on silvered ice. I took 10 seconds in the cab to map exit route, wheel angle, seam locations by memory. Pike's words sat in my chest like a cold stone. "You already picked where to run." The walk to the shack was 40 yards and felt longer. Snow hissed over the surface in low skims, soft against my boots, and each step sounded too loud in the quiet. The smell hit halfway there, that same wet fur musk, stronger than it had ever been, fresh enough to feel almost warm in the nostrils despite the cold. I stopped, scanned left to right, and saw nothing but trunk lines and drifting grain. Inside the shack, my breath fogged the lantern glass while I moved fast. Camera from loft shelf, back in padded sleeve, mantle kit, notebook copy, spare batteries, all into a duffel. I did a last sweep with my light and noticed my stool had been turned to face the back wall. I had not left it that way. On the table, my bait knife lay point down in the wood grain, sunk just enough to stand upright. That was not how I stored anything. I pulled it out, sheathed it, and stepped to the door. A sound rolled across the ice from my truck side. Not a crash, not a branch snap. 3 quick metallic taps on the passenger door skin, deliberate spacing, tap, tap, tap. My throat tightened so hard I had to force air through my nose. I shouldered the duffel, cracked the door, and killed my headlamp to let my eyes adjust to the truck beams. The highlights through a broad white lane past the shack, cutting across blowing snow and the first line of cedar trunks. Nothing moved in that lane. Then something crossed the far edge of the light. Close, too close, and my brain lagged half a beat behind what my eyes took in. It was not a full-body view, more like a sequence of pieces passing through brightness, as if a curtain kept opening and closing. First, an elongated snout, black and wet at the nose, pale frost clinging to whisker pads, breath pumping in dense huffs that flashed white and vanished. Then ragged dark fur along the neck and shoulder, clumped with ice pellets, longer than wolf guard hair and matted in ridges where melt had refrozen. Then the front limb, not a foreleg in any pattern I knew. It came down with a flexing motion like a hand deciding where to place weight. Long digits spread, 3-inch hooked claws finding purchase on glare ice with a dry scratch. I stood there and watched it plant that hand-like paw, lift and plant again with control. No bear had, and no man could mimic in that cold on bare ice. The arm carried muscle high through the shoulder and chest, heavy and compact like a lifter's frame under a pelt. Not lanky, not starved. When it turned slightly, high beams caught one eye full on, amber with green at the edge, reflective but not vacant, focused and tracking. I had the sick, absolute certainty of being studied, not startled. It stepped farther into the wash and I got the clearest partial look yet. At 20 yards, maybe a touch less, the lower body showed digitigrade structure. Heel lifted, joint loading backward and springing forward in a compressed, powerful stride. Wrong for a human, wrong for a wolf. Built for bursts over rough ground and ice seams if it chose right. One claw raked across the surface as it pivoted, carving a fresh groove that threw powder to the side. I heard the scrape over the engine. My body finally moved. I backed out, slammed the shack door behind me out of pure reflex, and walked fast toward the truck without turning my back fully. The creature paralleled me outside the direct beam, showing and disappearing in strips of light as snow gusted across. I kept the shotgun low, safety on. Pike had warned me about standing ground without an exit, and my exit was 20 feet ahead with the door open. The musk thickened. Another huff of breath hit the air, close enough that I felt it more than heard it. I swung my headlamp right and caught the snout again. Teeth visible this time in a half-open set, yellowed and long. Not bared in a wild charge, more like controlled testing. It was checking distance, angle, timing. Predators that panic make mistakes. This one looked methodical. Fear stopped being a feeling and turned into mechanics. Left hand on door frame, duffel thrown across seat, a shotgun on floorboard, boot on step. I got in, yanked the door shut, and locked it. At that instant, the creature moved into full side view for less than a second, shoulder and chest in the beams, fur lifting in the wind, arm raised. Claws struck the passenger side window with a hard chirp and slid off of its tempered glass, leaving white arcs that turned clear as heat from defrost hit. I dropped into reverse, steering wheel full left, and the rear tires spun once before biting. The truck pivoted. In mirror view, I saw it bound 2 strides alongside, then cut behind as if aiming for blindside. I braked just long enough to keep from dropping a rear wheel into the rough seam near the marker pole, shifted to drive, and gunned toward the access lane. Halfway there, the floodlight over my rear cab blinked out completely. The high beams stayed on. I did not look back again until I hit the packed trail. When I did, I caught only fragments. A dark, upright movement at the edge of the cedar line, then nothing but snow and my own tail light wash. I did not slow until County Blacktop, and even then I kept one hand on the wheel and one on the shotgun stock across my lap. My pulse hammered behind my eyes so hard road signs seemed to twitch. At the first open stretch with signal, I called Pike and put it on speaker. He answered with one word. Status: alive, vehicle intact, contact at 20 yards, partial visual confirmed, snout, digitigrade legs, hand-like forelimbs, claws on glass. It tracked to truck. You injured? No. Follow protocol now. Lit location. Do not go home first. Document while fresh. I'm heading to the shop. Good, I'm driving in. I reached Preston Auto and Marine in 12 minutes that felt like an hour. I parked inside Bay 1, dropped the door, and stood there in the yellow shop light with both hands on the workbench until my breathing came down from a sprint cadence. The passenger window carried 4 long curved scuffs through frost. The door skin had shallow dents near the top crease, too high for random ice chunks kicked by tire spray. I photographed everything with timestamps, then wrote until my hand cramped. Pike arrived 40 minutes later. Boots wet with road slush, wool cap pulled low. He walked the truck once without comment, stopped at the window marks, and measured spacing with a folding ruler from his pocket. He did not offer reassurance. He did not need to. Where's your film camera? He asked. Got it back. In the office. He looked relieved in a way that made me colder. Keep it on you, starting now. That line sounded odd until he asked what was in the duffel and I gave him the list. He nodded, then asked, Any item missing you expected to grab? I checked by habit. Lantern mantles, notebook copy, first aid pouch, knife, yes. Then I realized my insulated right glove was not in the pile. I had used both walking out. One came off when I wrote in the cab and went in my coat pocket. The other was gone. Lost a glove on the ice, I said. Maybe, Pike answered, but his eyes stayed on me instead of the table. He left near midnight after making me repeat a short plan out loud. Lockup sequence, sleep location, dawn check, no solo travel to Black Spruce. I chose the cot in my office with bay lights on and a clear path to the rear exit. I slept maybe 2 hours. At 6:30, I opened the back service door to take trash to the dumpster. And the first thing I saw was my missing glove hanging from the chain link gate at shoulder height, fingers threaded through the wire from the outside in. The leather was punctured in 4 places near the cuff, deep and clean. No blood, no chew marks from a dog, just punctures and a smell of cedar musk that did not belong in town. I stood there with the trash bag in my hand and felt my stomach drop into a calm, hard place. The gate sat in a narrow alley behind the shop. Snow drifted but not untouched. Tracks ran along the outer fence line where plow berm met shadow, spaced long, deeper than any human boot in that crust. They did not come to the door. They came to the gate, left the glove, and moved on. I called Pike. He arrived again before 8, crouched by the tracks, and photographed without speaking. We bagged the glove in a clean parts sack, labeled it, and logged location and time. He made one call from his truck to a former contact still inside the system, and got what sounded like a shrug wrapped in polite language. No team available. No rapid response for an unclassified sign set in town. File local hazard addendum and monitor. We filed it. I used exact wording: large unknown predator activity, evidence transfer pending, possible movement corridor from Black Spruce Cedar Swamp toward Iron Hollow Industrial Edge. I attached photos of gate placement, punctures, track depth, and vehicle marks. By noon, I had a confirmation email and a case extension number. By afternoon, Pike called back with the off-record result that matched his warning. The bagged glove was accepted local. The related biological swab request was marked incomplete because transfer forms were misrouted. Clean administrative language for evidence sinking into a hole. That evening I drove home while there was still light and checked my porch, garage slab, and side yard. No obvious sign. I should have felt better. I did not. The pattern was no longer random lake activity around bait and fish smells. It had selected an object from my hand, held it, carried it, and placed it where I would find it at first light. Not feeding behavior, not blind aggression. Communication through threat geometry. I told myself I was still dealing with an animal. No folklore, no myth frame, no campfire language. An animal can learn routes, an animal can map routine, an animal can probe defenses and wait. That was the line I could live with, and it was enough to make one fact plain. I was not sharing territory by accident anymore. I had been identified, sampled, and tracked from ridge to access to town. Prey does not need to understand the hunter's category. Prey only needs to understand timing. That night, I moved the rifle rack from my bedroom closet to the hall by the front door, set floodlights to manual override, and slept in my recliner, facing the windows, with boots on and keys in my coat pocket. I woke to the floodlights snapping on hard enough to burn white bars through my eyelids. I came up out of sleep in the recliner with my neck locked and my right hand already reaching for the rifle by the door. The house was silent for 2 beats. Then I heard a scrape along the aluminum siding on the garage wall, slow and deliberate, high enough that it sang across the metal instead of thudding near the foundation. My watch said 12:47. The lights cut out, came back, cut out again. I stayed low and moved to the front window, lifting one slat of the blind with 2 fingers. Snow blew flat across the driveway, thin and fast, and my truck sat under the yard pole light, with frost ghosting the windshield. At first, I saw nothing else, just the chain link gate and the drift line by the lilac bushes. Then 2 points flared at the edge of the detached garage roof, amber green and perfectly level, too far apart and too high for any dog, too steady for a reflection. I stepped back, grabbed my phone, and called dispatch. The woman who answered sounded tired and professional in that way people do on winter night shifts. County Dispatch. My name is Earl Preston, Iron Hollow, Cedar Street. I have large predator activity at my residence right now. It has already followed me from Black Spruce. I need a unit here. Any immediate injury, sir? No, not yet. Any weapon discharged? No. Pause. Keyboard clicks. Units are tied up on a rollover west of Spur 9. Closest available is at least 35 minutes. Stay inside, secure doors, avoid contact. I did that yesterday. It came to my fence and left my glove. Another pause. I see your prior hazard extension. We will notify wildlife officer on call. Do that now. We have done so, sir. Stay on the line if you feel unsafe. I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the line itself felt useless while something paced outside my house. I ended the call, dialed Pike, and he picked up on the first ring. It is here, I said, at my place. His voice stayed level. You got visual? Eyes above the garage line. You boxed in? Yes. Then do not wait for it to pick the approach. Move to the truck and keep motion. If it is hunting pattern, static makes you predictable. Dispatch says 35 minutes. You do not have 35? Get moving and keep me on speaker. The scrape came again, this time across the porch rail, followed by 3 heavy taps on the storm door frame. Not random impacts. Spaced. Testing. I killed the interior lights, slung my coat over one arm to break my outline, and went out the kitchen side, where the motion light was already dead. The cold hit like a shove. I stayed tight to the wall, boots quiet on the packed strip by the house, keys in my left glove, rifle in my right. Halfway to the truck I smelled it, wet fur and sour musk, dense enough to taste. I kept moving. Something landed behind me in the snow by the porch, with a weight that drove through crust to dirt. I did not turn. I hit the truck door, slid in, locked it, and dropped the rifle to the seat as I started the engine. I racked the rifle safe, then pulled the cab-mounted 12-gauge from behind the seat and set it within reach. Pike was still on speaker, voice clipped and calm. Status. In truck. Drive where you have open lanes and known terrain. No dead ends. There was no good answer to that inside town at 1 a.m. Streetlights were patchy, alleys blind, and my shop sat against a fenced back lot where I had already found tracks once. I pulled out anyway, took Main, then cut north toward the industrial edge. In the mirror, I saw movement clear one hedge line in a single low arc, then vanish between parked trailers. It was tracking the truck, not chasing full speed, matching turns. I called dispatch again while driving. Same operator, same constrained voice. The closest deputy was still tied up. Wildlife contact had not acknowledged yet. She told me to proceed to a populated location. I looked at the empty streets, dark storefronts, and plow berms shoulder high at every corner, and understood the crux in a way that stripped emotion clean off it. There was no populated location left at this hour that offered space, light, and reaction time. If I stopped, I would be boxed. If I kept circling town, I would eventually lose traction or line of sight. I told myself I had 2 assets left, my truck and my knowledge of black spruce under winter load. I knew the pressure ridge seam, knew where ice sang hollow, knew exactly where a heavy body could break through if forced to commit weight at speed. It was a hard plan and a desperate one, but it was still a plan. I turned south for the county road. Pike heard the change in engine pitch over speaker. Where are you headed? Lake. Long silence. Then, you using the seam? Yes. Then do not improvise once you start. Engine running, door open, keep your path clear. Light and noise to force the line you want. Understood. By 1:19, I hit the access pull-off at Black Spruce and nosed onto the packed trail with high beams burning. Wind had risen, driving powder across the ice in sheets that turned the beams into bright static. I parked 40 yards from the pressure ridge, exactly where I could reverse clean to the access line. I left the driver door open as Pike said. I pulled my portable propane heater from the truck bed, twisted the valve, and lit it. The burner caught with a hard roar that pushed orange light against the snow and made my own shadow jump across the door panel. I struck a road flare on the step rail and set it in the snow 10 feet beyond the heater, close to the thin seam I had mapped for years in my notebook. Red smoke and magnesium light blew sideways, painting the ice in violent color. My heart was hammering so hard I felt it in my teeth. I chambered 2 shells in the 12 gauge, not for center mass, not for heroics, just to crack ice at the right moment if it lunged where I needed it to lunge. The lake answered with silence first, then a long low boom under the sheet, pressure settling somewhere out in the dark. I kept my back to the truck, knees bent, muzzle down but ready, eyes moving from heater to ridge to cedar cut. My breath fogged and cleared in the flare light. Then it came. It stepped out of the cedar line at the edge of the high beams, and for the first time, nothing blocked the view. No drifting branches, no half-second silhouette, no fragmented pass-through light. The black spruce dogman stood fully exposed in the wash from headlights, flare, and lantern glare, reflecting off the truck hood, and every part of it was wrong in ways that locked straight into my nerves. It rose to near 8 feet when it straightened, shoulders massive and rounded forward like a heavyweight fighter, chest deep and barrel wide under shaggy black fur clumped with ice. The neck held too upright for any wolf frame, supporting a long-headed muzzle with a wet black nose and lips pulled just enough to show yellowed canines and side teeth built for shearing. Its ears sat high and angled, not flat, tracking sound independently. The eyes were amber with a green cast at the edge, reflective but focused, and they moved with intent from my face to my hands, to the truck door to the flare, calculating angles like a man sizing up a machine he intends to dismantle. Its forelimbs ended in hand-like paws with long digits and hooked claws curved and pale at the tips, each about the length of my thumb from knuckle to end. When it set them down, the claws bit the crust and scored grooves in a 4-line fan, not random scratching, controlled purchase. The hind legs were digitigrade and spring-loaded, heel elevated, joints flexing backward then driving forward in short, compressed tests as it shifted weight. Breath pumped from its muzzle in rhythmic bursts, huff and plume, each cloud silver in the beams and gone in an instant. The smell around it rolled thick, wet fur, musk, and old meat, under cold air. I had spent weeks trying to file this into bear, wolf, prank, grief, fatigue. Standing 10 yards from it, there was nothing left to file. It began to circle, not rushing. It drifted left, then cut right, testing whether I would track with the muzzle or brake for the cab. I matched the movement without overcommitting. My left boot was already aligned to the step. My right heel stayed outside, grounded for a shove backward. Pike was still on speaker in the cab, saying my name once, twice, quiet and sharp, but I could not spare a word. The dogman dipped its head, looked at the heater, then at me, then at the flare, burning near the seam. It had seen fire before. It respected it but did not fear it enough to retreat. The resulting tension was simple and terrible. It wanted me, and it was willing to eat risk to close distance. I lifted the heater by the handle and swung it out, not at the creature but across the seam line, letting the burner roar brighter as it landed and skidded, throwing sparks where metal scraped ice. The dogman flinched at the sudden heat and sound, then committed with one explosive drive off its hind legs, a low forward lunge that covered the distance in an instant. I moved at the same moment, dropping backward into the seat. One boot in, one boot out, left hand on wheel, right hand bringing the shotgun to the door frame. It hit the seam where I needed it to hit. Ice cracked under the lead leg with a gunshot pop and a deep ripping sound that ran under the sheet like torn fabric. One foreleg plunged through to the shoulder. The body slammed down, claws raking for purchase as the hindquarters twisted hard to stay up. I fired my first round into the ice beside its trapped hand, close enough to blast shards into its face and widen the fracture line. Not into flesh, into structure. The second shot went on the opposite side, same intent, forcing more brake and noise while I slammed the truck into reverse and floored it. Tires bit, then jerked free, and the truck surged backward toward access. In the beams, I saw the dogman wrench itself sideways with raw force, hauling the trapped leg out of black water and shattered plates. It came up limping hard on that side, shoulder low, one arm not taking full weight. A dark streak marked the ice behind it. Blood mixed with slush, and a drag arc ran 3 feet before it regained enough control to bound toward the cedar swamp. It did not pursue the truck. It hit the trees in 3 uneven strides and disappeared into black timber, leaving only the shake of lower branches and the smell. I kept reversing until I reached packed trail, then shifted and drove for the access road with both hands welded to the wheel. In the mirror, I watched the ridge and tree line until they dropped out of sight. Nothing followed onto open road. At County Blacktop, I pulled over under a sodium yard light and realized my split knuckles were dripping onto the steering column where recoil and door frame had skinned them. My right calf had gone tight and hot from the scramble at the door. I was shaking in full body waves now that motion had stopped, and my jaw would not unclench. Pike's voice came through speaker, thin with static. "Earl, report." "Alive," I said. "It is injured. It broke through the seam, pulled free, retreated to cedar. No pursuit." He exhaled once, long. "Drive straight to emergency and stay on lit roads. Do not stop at home. I will meet you there." I put the truck in gear and headed for town, heater still roaring in the bed. Flare smoke residue streaked across the tailgate, and the image of that full body in my headlights burned so deep, I knew sleep would not touch it for a long time. I reached Iron Hollow Regional just after 2 a.m. with the cab heat on full and both hands cramping around the steering wheel. Pike was already in the parking lot, standing under a sodium light with his coat open and his phone in one hand. He climbed in before I could get out and looked straight at my face, then my hands, then the way I was bracing my right leg. "You're going inside," he said. "No debate. I can walk. You are shivering so hard your teeth are clicking. Out." Inside triage, the nurse cut my glove off my right hand because the knuckles had swollen around the leather. Split skin, deep bruising, no fracture. My calf was worse than I had admitted. A partial tear from planting hard on slick ice while half in and half out of the truck. Mild hypothermia, they called it. Core temp down. Judgment likely impaired. Keep him for observation. I remember the words because they sounded clinical and neat, and nothing about that night felt neat. They wrapped me in warmed blankets, started fluids, and asked what happened. I gave the shortest true sentence I could manage. Large unknown predator, ice exposure. I had to move fast. A deputy came by around 4:30, tired eyes, road salt on his pant cuffs, notebook out. I gave him the same thing I had given dispatch and wildlife before. Timeline, location, hazard behavior, no shots fired into the animal, 2 rounds into ice. He wrote it down and paused when I said the animal moved upright with hand-like forelimbs. Canine or bear? He asked. Neither pattern fits. He looked at Pike, then back at me. I'll log it as unidentified large predator activity near black spruce with public safety concern. That gets patrol attention without editorial. That works, Pike said quietly. By sunrise, my body had stopped shaking, but my nerves had not. They released me near 8 with strict instructions. Rest, no heavy lifting, monitor for cold-related symptoms, follow up on the leg. I walked out into hard blue morning light and stood in the lot, breathing exhaust and snow air like I had never appreciated plain oxygen before. Pike asked if I wanted him to drive me home. I told him no. I drove to my shop, parked behind Bay 2, and sat there with the engine off, unable to make myself enter a building. Walls felt like traps. The memory of those eyes tracking my door hand made my chest tighten until I thought I would be sick. I reclined the seat and slept in short, jagged bursts for what turned out to be 12 hours, waking every time wind rattled the ladder rack. The next morning, with daylight solid and my head finally clear enough to sequence tasks, Pike and I went back to Black Spruce in his truck and mine. Travis met us at the access because he refused to let me walk that ice on a torn calf alone. We moved as a 3-man line and documented everything before weather could erase it. The seam was blown open where I'd forced the lunge. There were drag arcs, churned plates, and dark droplets frozen in a crescent leading toward the cedar swamp. We photographed scale markers, collected swabs from the blood-flecked ice, bagged a sliver of tissue caught on a broken crust edge, and cast the freshest prints we could still read near the retreat path. I retrieved the portable heater from where it had skidded and went cold, and we logged its position because position explained intent. The flare had burned out and welded a red-black stain into the ice surface. We photographed that too. Back at the shop office, I laid every physical item out on clean butcher paper and checked it against my notebook, so nothing went missing by neglect. Plaster casts from earlier tracks, now numbered and dated. The first bagged hair sample from the shack wall, trail camera cards, and both damaged camera units. Film camera recovered from the loft, then developed same day at the 1-hour lab in Marquette because I did not trust delay. The negatives showed the gouges, marker pole, and shack approach exactly as I had remembered. Photos of truck window scuffs and door dents. The punctured glove from the gate, still in the parts sack. New seam photos, blood swabs, and the small tissue fragment from retreat line. I duplicated everything digital to 2 drives, printed hard copies, and put 1 set in a lockbox at the shop and 1 in Gail's duplex basement safe. I had learned routine can be mapped and evidence can vanish. That afternoon, I filed the formal version I could get accepted. Large unknown predator activity. Aggressive investigative behavior around occupied structures. Public safety risk at night near Black Spruce access and Iron Hollow industrial edge. I attached prints, measurements, and photos without using folklore language. I submitted through county wildlife intake and copied the sheriff office, plus the original conservation officer who had given me the first case number. His callback came 2 days later, and his tone was careful. "Mr. Preston, we received your supplemental package. The state lab accepted biological transfer request, pending chain confirmation." "Pending what exactly?" "Inter-office routing validation." I looked at Pike while the officer talked. Pike gave me that flat look that said he had heard this script before. 3 days later, we got official notice that one blood sample was degraded in transit, and one swab was insufficient for classification. The tissue fragment was logged at local intake, then marked not located at transfer. No apology, just administrative language. Off the record, Pike called me that evening. "It disappeared between desks," he said. "Same corridor as the old files." "So that is it. For the lab, yes. For your decisions, no." I still had my copies, my logs, my witness in Travis, and Pike's case notes from the 90s. He eventually showed me those notes at his kitchen table one Sunday in February. No grand reveal, no conspiracy speech, just yellowing pages and terse entries. Livestock torn fences, abnormal stride reports, one patrolman refusing night cedar roots after elevated eye-shine contact. He had stopped mid-sentence the first time we met because he did not trust me yet. He told me that plainly. "I watched too many men chase certainty into bad ground," he said. "I needed to know you would choose survival over pride." By the second week of February, I made the first concrete change that hurt but helped. I sold the ice shack. Not to a hobby fisherman, to a salvage outfit that stripped the runners and framing. I stood there while they winched it onto a flatbed and felt like I was burying part of the life I had built after Lena died. Then I felt lighter. Not healed lighter. I stopped night fishing outright. I fish now only in daytime on crowded lakes with plowed access and other trucks in sight. I changed shop operations next. Winter hours became 7 to 4:30. Strict closing bell before dark. No exceptions for quick jobs. I installed floodlights on all corners, reinforced the back service door, upgraded cameras with redundant power, and cut the chain link gate into a full steel panel with internal latch. I stocked trauma kits, flare gun, and a rifle in both truck and garage, not as a fantasy of control, as practical redundancy. I rewrote roadside policy on a clipboard by the office door. No solo calls after sunset, period. If someone wanted me out at night, they got me plus a second vehicle and a second set of eyes. Gail did what sisters do when your pride finally cracks. She showed up with a key ring and said, "You are staying at my duplex until spring. Argue if you want." I brought boxes. I did not argue. For 6 months, I slept in one side of her place in Marquette, 3 nights a week, and at my house only with lights, cameras, and routines locked in. We talked more in those months than we had in 10 years. I told her the full story without sanding edges off it. She did not laugh, did not diagnose me, did not ask if I had been drinking. She made coffee, listened, and started sending me listings for therapists who handled trauma in first responders and veterans. I picked one. Best practical decision I made after surviving. Not everyone stayed. Ray and Vince from the bait shop joked once too often after hearing a cleaned-up version from someone at dispatch. I left my worms on the counter and walked out. We have not been close since. Travis stayed close. Pike closer. He calls every Thursday evening, same rough voice, same first word. Status. Safe, I usually say. Present day, I am 58, still in Iron Hollow, still running Preston Auto and Marine, now with an apprentice named Nolan, which makes Pike roll his eyes every time he hears it. We close before dark all winter. We do clean work and keep records tight. I still keep the lockbox with copies of every photo, cast log, and report receipt, including the dismissive emails and the chain of custody forms that somehow led nowhere. I marked each unresolved transfer as abandoned evidence in my own index, because pretending those samples are still moving would be self-deception. I sleep better than I did the first year after it happened, but not perfectly. Wind over frozen eaves can spike my pulse in a second. The smell of wet dog in a warm garage can pull me halfway back to that lake if I let it. Therapy gave me drills that actually work. Feet on floor. Count 5 metal objects in view. 4 sounds. 3 points of contact. Slow exhale. Longer than inhale. Repeat until my body accepts the room I am in. I do that in the office, in the truck, in grocery lines if needed. Function first. Pride later. I still get asked, usually in low voices near the coffee machine, whether I think it was a bear with mange or a man in gear or winter grief. I answer the same way every time. I tracked sign for weeks. I measured what I saw against fixed markers I installed myself. I had one corroborating witness at daylight silhouette range, and one retired warden who had seen the same pattern decades earlier. I watched that thing in full light at close distance, and survived by forcing it on to bad ice, then leaving without playing hero. I call it the black spruce, dogman, because a name helps your mind store an event without softening it into rumor. I am safe now. The immediate threat ended that night when it limped into Cedar and did not pursue beyond the ridge. I built my life around not offering it the same advantage twice. That is the part I can control, and control is enough to live on. I am no longer skeptical. I am also no longer careless. You can call that fear if you want. I call it maintenance.